Good afternoon.
Another beautiful day in paradise, isn't it? You know, when I think about trying to set the tone for what we're about to discuss, and I have to think about some of the books that were written by other prisoners of war during that era, when hell was in session, in the presence of my enemy, the passing of the night, a prisoner's duty, the long road home. But what means so much to me is a simple 3 words: return with honor. You know, when I was growing up in a little cotton mill town a few miles east of here, and as most small towns, they have certain things to honor veterans, whether it be like we have in Loudon County, where they have the banners up around the courthouse to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Or just in my hometown, they had a giant wall to a 9-year-old, you might say. And behind that plexiglass wall, next to it was a beautiful American flag. And as I looked at it, it was just simply name after name after name. Finally, my grandfather broke the silence of what that wall was all about. He said, they're the ones, when our country came in on attack in 1941, they're the ones that raised their right hand and said, take me. I want to defend America. As we looked at those names, there was my father, my uncle, several of my senior cousins, and the neighborhood people that I knew. Some I was never aware that had ever donned a uniform of this great nation. Well, we discussed many of them, and in all the discussions, you know, we've all been intrigued by stars. And as I looked at those names, several of the stars, names had stars beside them. You know, I'm thinking, gee whiz, you know, my dad, my uncle, none of my family members or anybody I knew had a star. So I was, you might say, a little disappointed because I knew it was something important. And I asked my grandfather, I said, what was that star for? With kind of a lump in his throat and a tear in his eyes, he said, they're the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we have today. And so for a moment there, I realized how blessed I was that all of my family members who went off to war came home in one piece. You fast forward to my generation, we have a wall with over 58,479 stars of those of my generation that gave their all for this country. We like to breeze over it. And you never hear anything about the 1,500 plus that's still missing in action. You don't hear that of the 58 plus thousand, 39,000 of them were 22 years of age or younger. You don't hear that 36,000 of them were 19 years of age and younger. You don't hear about the fathers, sons, brothers and brothers, cousins and cousins that died on the battlefield for this great land. We don't hear much about the 17-year-old that died in Vietnam. We very seldom hear anything about the 16-year-old that gave his life on the battlefield for this country. And you never hear about the 14-year-old that gave his life for this country at the mere age of 14. You know, Vietnam interrupted over 7 million families and altered their life perspective, you might say. And I cannot speak for all 7 million plus families that had their life altered as a result of Vietnam. So I can condense it down into one story that is of mine. I guess that for the military members that hear that, you know, I always tell them that the first thing I learned when I joined the military was that recruiters, weathermen, politicians, and used car salesmen had all graduated from the same school. No offense, sir. We love you. we love those who bear the truth. You know, he sent me to Loudon Air Force Base, and Air Force was on a 4-day vacation with one change in the underwear. And so you might say we were a pretty smelly bunch by the time we got through and was given our uniforms, you know, and eventually I was made into a road guard because it very obviously I needed additional exercise. And one of my friends that came with us, we picked up in South Carolina when we were flying to Loudon, his eyes were a little offset, so the TIs made him a road guard because he could see in 2 directions at once. We went through basic training. From there, I went to Shepherd Air Force Base, and eventually they kept telling me, this is not the real Air Force. The real Air Force is just out there waiting for you. Just go ahead and be patient. So the next thing you know, they put a little dream sheet in front of me, and so my brother-in-law had just come back from Alaska, and I thought, well, gee whiz, that'd be a great place to start, you know. So I volunteered for Alaska, and 3 of my classmates went to Alaska, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma, and just 40 miles up the road. And eventually, I was told that I would probably spend the rest of my career at Altus unless I died or retired. And the next thing you know, I had an assignment to Osan, Korea. And I went over and served my country there. But the important thing that came out of that was I went into this crusty old sergeant's office. I do not know whether it was part of the official briefing or whether it was just him speaking from the heart. He just looked at me and said, Airman, something you need to know. When you leave for Korea, you represent yourself, you represent your family, you represent the United States Air Force. But most of all, you represent the United States of America. And I spent a lifetime wishing Jane Fonda had gotten that briefing. But when my time was nearing an end in Korea, I got that again to fill out a dream sheet, knowing how well the last one worked. I just took my piece of paper and in bold print wrote anywhere USA on it and turned it back in. And of course, that's when I got an instant office visit with the chief. And that's when I learned about Will Rogers. I learned that there's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Because when I went in with his guiding hand, I filled up my statistics to say I wanted to go to North Carolina was my home at Seymour Johnson. Florida was my state of choice, and Southeast was the area of choice. And so when my assignment came down, it was Grand Forks, North Dakota. After arriving at Grand Forks, they said, oh, by the way, you know that this, we're getting ready to close. You need to think about where you'd like to go from here. And I was thinking I was 3 years, just a few more months, and I'd be just cashing in my chips and going to the house. And so that was the plan at that moment. So eventually, the next thing I know, this thing called Southeast Asia started popping up on the radar. And I was semi-volunteered, I guess you might say, simply for the needs of the government. And I sat there and I said, am I ready for this? And I thought about just in the last 3 years of my life, between the ages of 18 and 21. I sat down in the break room with World War II and Korean War veterans, and it would talk about the war, but sometimes we spend more time talking about our failures than our successes. The next thing you know, the conversation went to the Bay of Pigs. These guys had participated, and they And they simply said, you know why the Bay of Pigs failed? It wasn't because of military might or political conviction. It was because we could not communicate. That was a complete failure in America's because we could not communicate. I was on active duty during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I saw that, and all have worked diligently and solved that communication problem. For within hours after identifying those missiles on the island of Cuba, they were being repackaged and sent back to Russia. They understood the might of this country. I was still standing there with those guys and says, hang loose, we'll get through this. Next thing you know, I'm in Korea on the 22nd of November 1963. Our president was assassinated. Again, the same thing, you know, all the youngsters are thinking, we're going to war with somebody over something. And the old guy said, no, just calm down, we'll get through this. And sure enough, we smoothly went through it. And the next thing you know, it was politic time again. And a man stood up with pride and understanding and says, I'm not going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves. He said that in 1964 and was elected. Took office for the second time in 65, and in 67 he had over 600,000 Americans on the battlefield in Southeast Asia. My trip, essentially, I tell people that, because of the secrecy involved, you couldn't tell anybody where you were going, how you were going to get there, and where you were when you got there. So I tell people I felt like a true Democrat. Didn't know where I was going, wasn't sure where I was when I got there, and did it all on borrowed money. When I arrived there, we were a little outpost 7 miles from enemy territory. We were building an opportunity for pilots that were basically at that point in time, we were just trying to cut supply lines from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. And occasionally an airplane would get shot down and we would try to go to retrieve the pilot. Well, as most of you know, it's a lot of time we get an idea before we get the equipment to do the job. And so we had to take something we already had. We had an H-43, which was an LBR airplane, stood for Local Base Rescue. We turned it into a combat airplane with a piece of quarter-inch steel underneath the pilot and the co-pilot seat. And we sat on our World War II flak vest in the back. But we were ready to go to war. We're ready to do our part. We realized that we didn't have the fuel range that we needed to do the job, so a group of NCOs might say they banged their heads together and we came up with the first in-flight refueling with helicopters, which is basically a 55-gallon barrel, 2 quick disconnects, and a garden hose. But we were going to get the job done. And that's the way we flew. In fact, I get credit for unofficially in Air Force history of making 2 bombing runs over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel, because that was one of the responsibilities, was to drain the fuel into the tank once we had room for it, retrieve the disconnects, quick disconnects and garden hose, and get rid of the 55-gallon barrel. Basically, I said to the gentleman over here earlier, I said, we were noted for our twos. And somebody said, what's that? I said, that's too low, too slow for too long. And we were excited. We had come to the end of our 3-month TDY. We just sat over there. The Air Force had bought a new airplane and they brought it over. And I'm sure that many of you, I say to Mr. Maddle out there, as many different types of equipment he's had to buy and how much problems he's had with every use of piece of equipment he brought on board. And we had the same thing with this airplane. It just was not ready for combat. And so we were extended for the duration. and I was shot down in the 6th month of my 3-month TDY. On the 20th of September, 1965, you might say simply, my life changed forever. I'd say truthfully I experienced several miracles in a matter of seconds, you might say. How we got an airplane blown out of the sky without a bullet hole in us, how we saw holes appear in the airplane and none in us. We took heavy arms as we were in a hover, and after we took hits, next thing you know, we started falling. I'm operating a horse, so I'm hanging outside the airplane and guiding the pilot as well as trying to get that donut up to the pilot on the ground. And everything happened just at once. By the time he got the hold of the donut and was getting in it, we started taking heavy arm, light on fire, and hit our fuel control, and the airplane stalled, and next thing you know, we were chopping bamboo, and I'm here to replace the blades on the 43 are not good for chopping bamboo, because we fell about 90 feet and hit the jungle the floor. Fortunate for us, we didn't fall on something solid. We fell on the jungle floor, and that created our survival at that point. Once we hit the ground, the pilot we were trying to rescue was there, and he told us the place was infested and we had to get out of the area. And of course, that was the rules. Basically, when an airplane went down in enemy territory, you have about 30 minutes to get away from it. Otherwise, you're going to be blown up with the airplane, because they're going to come in and blow it up in order to make sure that nothing on the airplane falls in enemy hands. And so we got about a mile and a half away, or maybe even less. I don't remember, because in the excitement, but we knew that we couldn't travel during the daytime, so we had to find hiding and hopefully evade at night and be picked up the next morning. So that was our dream at that point. We sought hiding, and we thought we'd successfully hid, but as we were there, we could hear the voices of the Vietnamese continuing to get louder and more. And eventually, they recognized where we were, and we looked out from where we were hiding. There was probably anywhere from 100 to 150 of them standing there with everything from machine guns to machetes. And our pilot looked at myself and Airman Black and said, "Lived to fight another day." We could have easily taken out 2 or 3, but with a 6-shooter. But once that was out of bullets, then we were out. And so we could have fought to the death at that point, benefiting no one. So we were taken into captivity at that point. First we were treated humanely. They were checking for whether we had any wounds or anything that required attention, whether we were hungry or whatever. They hog-tied us, you might say, and then they led us down out of the mountains. And then we were put on static displays like a prize trophy. And that went quite well, because the Vietnamese, are a foot shorter and 100 pounds lighter than we are, so it wasn't like we could blend in the neighborhood. And, at first they were concerned about us, and then next thing you know, kind of like in our country today, a blowhorn shows up, and the next thing you know, everybody turned against us, and they were beating us just because we were Americans. Even the guards got beat while they were trying to protect us, and eventually they did get us out of that. But they completed that thing 2 or 3 different times over the next couple of days, and they thought it was cute, but meanwhile we carried the bruises along with the guards that were trying to guard us. But they got a little more creative one day, and they took me out, and of course my feet are tied together at my ankles with just enough room that you could shuffle. We eventually named it the Hanoi Shuffle, and then they tied our hands together at our wrists and our elbows behind our back, and they blindfolded us. And I was taken out, and I could hear from the voices there was a crowd of Vietnamese, and I could lean back and I could see many Vietnamese out there. But the one thing that caught my eye was that hole in the ground that they knelt me down next to. And I thought at that moment, my life here on earth was over. 2 guards I could see from the shadow standing behind me with their weapons pointed at me. someone started to speak like in an official capacity, and I was just imagining that I was hearing my charges, their findings, and the last thing would be what they were going to do about it. And somewhere along in there, it seemed like that, like I said, I had created a speed dial, and me and the good Lord were talking quite a bit during that period of time, even though it seemed like hours, it was probably only seconds. And I had made peace, and I was ready to give all for my country. But then a voice from a distance, or may have been from the same area, all of a sudden everything stopped. The Vietnamese behind me lowered their weapons, and they run their arms up under my armpits and lifted me up and took me back to the makeshift cell. At that point, I knew my life had been spared for a reason. And I was convinced, I not knew what the future held, but I was going to survive this thing. God had sent me a message that survival was in my thing. Eventually, I was turned over to the regular military, and it was kind of a no-nonsense transportation from that point on, and we finally arrived in what we called Hanoi, and about a block from what the prison we call the Hanoi Hilton, that the Vietnamese removed our blindfold and said, "Home." And I realized later that he and I were about 12,000 miles apart. I'm thinking San Francisco, and he's thinking the Hanoi Hilton. As I look at these high walls that were probably 20, 25 feet high with broken glass and concertina wire on the top and well lit, and then we walked through a double set of doors, and when we got out of the second doors, I didn't see my pilot or the guy I was trying to rescue for 7 years. We went in different directions. I ended up what we now know as the New Guy Village. Through a maze of hallways and ended up back in the back corner of the Hilton complex. Once I was in the cell, they had stripped me of everything, and I'm standing there wondering what the next move was. And I happened to look around, and all of a sudden, someone had carved the alphabet in the little corner. And it just gave me you might say, a hang-on type attitude. And somebody else has survived this, so I can too. The Vietnamese wore sandals, much like our flip-flops, and you could hear them coming on the concrete floor for quite a ways. But as soon as that voice of that sandal noise had left, a voice rang out identifying himself as Colonel Robinson Reisner, the senior ranking prisoner of war at that time. And he simply said, "Be prepared to die for your country." I was less than a month past my 22nd birthday, and I had a lot of other things I had in mind that I would like to do rather than be considering this. We were interrupted a couple of times, and eventually he came back and he says, "If we survive, we must return with honor." And so you might say I had simple guidance and understanding of what my responsibility was for the next while. As I stood there, the Vietnamese opened up the little trap door, and I handed in a short shirt, a long shirt, a short pair of pants, a long pair of pants, much like pajamas with a drawstring, a bar of soap, a tube of toothpaste, a toothbrush, a hand towel, a mosquito net, a blanket, and a metal cup. As I looked at him sitting there on this bed that was for about 4.5 feet long, about 16 inches wide, with a bucket at the end of the bed, little did I know at that point, they would be my worldly possessions for the next 8 Thanksgivings, 8 Christmases, and 8 New Years I was ringing in captivity. One other thing Colonel Reiser said was learn the tap code. And that's what I learned. That little alphabet down in the corner was 4. See, we took the alphabet, in order to square it up, we dropped the K and used a C in the place of K, and that way you could tap. You first identify from top to bottom, then left to right. In other words, if you wanted to send a B, for instance, you tap 1 time to identify the first row, 2 times to identify the second letter on that row, and would be a B. And if you wanted to send an R, for instance, you go down 4 rows and tap twice, and the second letter on the 4th row. And a Z would essentially be 5 rows down, 5 letters across. You can see where that was a much easier form than the long code, which was 1 tap was an A and 26 taps was a Z. Some tried to use Morse code because most of us were required to acknowledge that, but it's hard to transmit or scratch through an 18-inch thick wall. So that was just about out of the question. Our cells, like I said, that I spent some time in a 3x3 box. I spent some time in a foxhole that's half filled with water that you couldn't stand up in, you couldn't sit down in because there just wasn't enough room. And then when they pulled us out of those situations, says, we understand that if you continue to resist, you will be punished. The cells we averagely lived in, the first one I lived in, I could stretch my arms in either direction to touch the outside walls. The food we ate was, I jokingly say we ate Oriental style. Somebody says, what's Oriental style? I said, that's a bowl of rice for breakfast, a glass of water for lunch, and swell up for supper. But the reality, we ate the vegetable of the season, and we hear the report that grass grows year-round in Vietnam. We ate somewhere, we figured between 100 and 120 different varieties of grass, but it kept us alive. Our mainstay was either bread, thank God the French had been over and taught them how to make bread, or a bowl full of rice. Essentially, the things we didn't have, we had no radio, no TV, no cell phones, of course. We didn't wear Nikes. We wore shoes that we cut out the sidewall of an old car tire. But we made do with what we had. We gain our strength from ourselves, our families. And I'm going back and remembering, my mother once told me, she said, Billy, you'll never be burdened more than you can stand. And I can remember many times I said, Mom, we're getting close. And then things would just seem to lighten up. We adopted a motto, never give up, never give in, roll with the punches, bounce back, get ready for the next round. New shoot downs were our lifeline. They came in with encouraging words, and they believed, and we all believed, that the war could have been over in 3 months if we'd had the leadership in Washington to get it done. But they chose to drag it on, you know. I think the most devastating point to us was after making it through the Christmas of '65, then Robert McNamara took to the airways and announced that the prisoners of war were expendable. We know political tactics, and we kind of laughed at it. But could you imagine how our families felt? Could you imagine how my parents felt when they were told that their son was expendable? Wives were told that their husbands were expendable. Fathers were told that their sons were expendable. He come back and tried to justify it later and explain what he was just trying to get the pressure off of us. But the reality was he was trying to get us off the front pages of the newspaper. And as a result of that action, he succeeded. Not only did we get relegated to the back of the pages of the newspaper, we eventually didn't make the paper at all. We lived on simple 4 letters, hope, H-O-P-E. Eventually, I moved out to what we refer to as the briar patch. We had no running water, no electricity, And they would hog tie us in the morning and leave us that way all day long and then untie us at night. We were fed just before daybreak and released just after dark and fed. We lived this way off and on for over a year. Eventually, because of our health failing, they brought us back to civilization, and I never thought I would describe civilization as simply running water and electricity. During that period of time, in January '66, when things were not going in anybody's direction, a lot of pressure was put on the Vietnamese, and they decided to have a show and tell. In July of '66, they marched 52 American prisoners of war through the main streets of Hanoi. At the time of brutality, many of them came away with some permanent injuries as a result of the activity of the Vietnamese at that particular time. Ho Chi Minh never apologized for the way the American prisoners of war were treated, but he did say if we asked for forgiveness, then we would be forgiven and allowed to return home at the end of the war. So they set up a new program where they needed to beat most of us to death. First, they wanted us to choose the way of the Johnson administration or the peace-loving American people, and we refused to choose, and they beat us for that. And so then we decided to choose, and lo and behold, we chose the wrong way, and so we got beaten for that. And then they beat us because they wanted us to confess of our crimes. Our leader stepped in at that time and said, don't sustain permanent injuries. Know when to say when and call it a day. And it's amazing during that period of time that all of us had special people we flew with. Clark Kent was probably the most popular wingman in Vietnam, especially over the north. We flew with Red Buttons and John Wayne and all these other guys. In fact, I got called into interrogation one time, wanted to know more about this Clark Kent fellow. Said one minute he's flying in the Air Force, next minute he's flying in the Navy, and then he's flying in the Marine Corps. What does he do? I told him he was a Roman ambassador that just went from service to service, checking on and seeing how everybody was doing. And so, once we moved back from the Briar Patch, they had always been trying to keep us in small groups, solitary or semi-solitary. Fortunate for me, I only spent about 8 months in solitary confinement, where some guys spend as much as 4 years. And so they were forced to kind of come up with larger rooms and put us together, and I moved into a room of nine total, or 8 other guys. And we were looking for that quote sign, and said, this is it. They're putting us together so we won't look so spastic when we leave here, and so we're just a matter of time, we'll be going home. And sure enough, shortly after that, President Johnson stopped the bombing of North Vietnam, and if you'd have been listening, you could have heard us shouting in San Francisco, because we just believed that we were on our way home. And then when it all really settled, we waited. And we waited. President Johnson did not ask for a single concession as far as the prisoners of war, did not ask how we were doing or anything. He was more interested in getting Humpty Dumpty elected than was the American prisoners of war on the battlefield in Vietnam. So you might say that word expendable became apparent even from the lips of the President of the United States. Those guys that were being shot down, and they were coming in with the words, the war can't last 3 more months, we'll be out of here before Christmas, was essentially taken away from us for the next 3 years. We had no insight other than reading it between the lines. One of the good things that did come out of the International Red Cross tried to negotiate with the Vietnamese on the treatment of prisoners of war, but Vietnam said, no, we'll deal with it on our own. The American Red Cross did send packages to us in Vietnam, but they ended up finding them on dead soldiers, the North Vietnamese soldiers in South Vietnam. But eventually, after the bombing stopped, they allowed our families to send us a small care package. It consisted of things like coffee, tea, bouillon cubes, bacon bits, a hand towel, or soap or something of that nature. I remember a friend of mine sitting there just cradling a pack of Kool-Aid. We said, why just a pack of Kool-Aid? No, that was the first contact he'd had with his family in 4 years, was over a pack of Kool-Aid. We dreamt of how these packages were put together, and it turned out exactly well. The families used to gather once a month, and they would pass these items around amongst them before it was put in a box and sent to us as a solidarity. You see, President Johnson just told the POW families to go away and don't bother. Not a single POW family entered the White House during the LBJ administration. Once the election was over, one of the first meetings of POWs was held at the White House with President Nixon. Families felt they had a friend that they hadn't had for so long. That thing we call faith that we had lived on up to this point, we call it four faiths. Faith in ourselves, that we had the tools to get the job done. Faith in each other, that we would stand shoulder to shoulder and eventually someday return home with honor. Faith in our country, that it would not abandon us under difficult circumstances. But most of all, faith in our God. He would see us through. I talk about the conditions that I lived under, but compared to my brothers in South Vietnam, I was enjoying luxury accommodations. Many of those guys were captured and held in bamboo cages. See, there was no front line, and so they were even used as bargaining chips. And when some of them were unable to travel with the renegade bunches that they were with, they were just executed. We have a firm accounting of 131 that died in prison camps in North Vietnam from neglect and brutality by the North Vietnamese. But God only knows how many died in South Vietnam that never got to come home. And so they are the ones that we look at, the real heroes that put everything on the line for this great land of ours. When President Nixon took over, it was exciting as we looked out and we saw the Vietnamese digging foxholes, and just because he had convinced them he was coming, and we were going to welcome that. But when things were having its ups and downs and negotiations were going on, which we weren't made aware of, this thing called Santé, which much like the Bra Patch that I had spent some time in, they went in and they convinced President Nixon that there were about 60 POWs there and we could go in there and extract them. Those guys put together a team made up of Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and they trained at Eglin Air Force Base. And when the whistle blew, they were ready. Unfortunately, because of not wanting to draw any attention to it, we had quit flying reconnaissance missions over that area and weren't aware that just days before the event that the prisoners were moved out. Not for any other thing other than conditions like it was at the Bri Patch, and the people's health was starting to fail, and so they realized that eventually the war would end and they would have to account for everybody. Eventually, some described that mission on November 20th as a failure. But for those of us who were there, it was the first opportunity to see how our lives could change. Because as a result of that action, that expendable label was removed and high value was put back on us, and we were moved together. The Henry Hilton, what you were using as a processing center and probably using about 10 or 15% of the whole area, was cleaned out. The next thing you know, guys that had been in solitary confinement for the last 4 years all of a sudden walked in a room and had 40 other roommates. So you might say it changed our life from hell to a livable hell. I saw my military at the finest as the senior ranking officers stood up and took their position in front of the Vietnamese. It was a do or die situation. And each time that senior ranking officer was drug out, another one stood up. And eventually, after going 4 and 5 deep, the Vietnamese finally gave in to our demands. That was the first major victory we won as the prisoners of war in Vietnam. As a result of that action of the Sante, which, like I said, even Senator McCain referred to it as a failure, but probably 30 or 40 guys that would not survived another 2 years in the conditions in which we lived under got to come home and live out a full life with their family. You know, when you think about time, I think about a friend of mine whose son was a sophomore in high school when he was shot down, or he finished up his sophomore year. Graduated from high school, graduated from college, joined the Air Force, went through pilot training, and was flying combat missions in South Vietnam. His dad was still a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. That's how far it stretched over the family. Someone asked me one time, said you could describe is there a short version of POW life? And I can say yes, there's minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and yes, even years of boredom punctuated by terror. You know, I think about all the things that happened. I think one of probably the biggest morale thing was a simple thing. I had mentioned those packages earlier. We did not know until someone received a little sugar pack in one of those packages, and they showed Neil Armstrong stepping off on the moon. That's how you might say our mail or anything was censored as far as the Vietnamese were concerned. But we found out about Neil Armstrong on the moon from back of sugar pack. When I think about the time once we moved together, I had a friend of mine that's Mike Christensen. Mike Christensen was just a simple young man that referred to himself from coming up in humble beginnings, joined the Navy, became a flight officer, was flying combat missions in Vietnam and was shot down and captured. At one point when we moved together, Mike said that something is missing here. And it was as simple as the American flag. So Mike took it upon himself and gathered material. He got some clay tile from the roof and cigarette ashes and started making colors, making stars out of various things from buttons to just a piece of cloth, you know. And he had to figure out a way to put it all together. So he took a bamboo stick and he sharpened it on the concrete floor and punched holes in the back of his shirt and used thread from his blanket to don the first American flag that was flown over North Vietnam. When Mike had completed that flag, he proudly displayed it in his room. Senator McCain was in that room, and that right next, I was in the room next door. And he described the moment as Mike unfurled that flag, as they stood up strong, straight, with their crippled bodies, and recited the Pledge of Allegiance together. You might say that it started a flurry throughout the camps, but Mike's was the first flag. Unbeknownst to us, the Vietnamese pulled a surprise inspection and found that flag, and they went absolutely ballistic. Mike, being the person he was, identified himself as the maker of the flag and took the punishment that went with it. As a result of that, when he arrived at the front of the room, they hit him over the back of the head with a rifle butt, and he fell semi-unconscious in front of his roommates. As they went forward to help Mike, the Vietnamese locked and loaded as they dragged Mike out of the room feet first. Essentially, Mike was the last guy ever tortured in Vietnam, not for military information or for propaganda, but just because he wanted to share an American flag with his brothers. As a result of that, Mike was brought back near death and then dumped in front of his roommates. So according to McCain, they weren't sure that Mike would survive through the night, but Mike was strong. And with a cold water, a washcloth, and prayer, they brought Mike back. Eventually one day, Mike sat up in the middle of his bed with a grin from ear to ear and announced to his roommates, time for flag number 2. You never give up, you never give in, you roll with the punches, you bounce back, you get ready for the next round. We saw the ups and downs, and more positive than negative. When Nixon took over, President Johnson had unarmed the South Vietnamese. They did not even have a standing army. They were carrying essentially wooden guns. We were doing all the fighting. We were doing all the dying. Our American sons. President Nixon took over, and the first thing he did was put the Vietnamese back in charge of their own war. As they stood up, we stood down, and eventually we reached a point. You see, in 1965, when I was shot down, there was less than 20,000 troops in Southeast Asia, and it went over 600,000 by 67, 68, 69. President Nixon started bringing the force down, and by December of 72, we were approximately 20,000 troops in Southeast Asia. All agreements had been reached with the Vietnamese except for one, and that was how to handle the prisoners of war. The Vietnamese said, oh, just go in the house, we'll take care of that later. And President Nixon said, no, we'll take care of it now. We were well aware there were prisoners that had been captured in Dien Bien Phu in 1954 that were still prisoners of war in North Vietnam. They were French Foreign Legion, and they weren't released until 1979. And Nixon nor our country would allow that to happen to us. As a result of that, the Vietnamese got up and walked away from the peace table. President Nixon unleashed what was referred to as Linebacker 2. For a period of 11 days, we dropped more bombs than ever been dropped in the history of mankind, not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of Americans being held in captivity in North Vietnam, Cambodia, South Vietnam, and Laos. As a result of that action, the Vietnamese came back to the peace table. I think about that first night, I think about Walter Ferguson. He was the first man to die that night. He was a tail gunner on a B-52. Of his crew, only 3 survived, of the 6 on board. I went back and looked up Walter and realized that he and I had been at Altus, Oklahoma some 10 years before. We had probably seen each other's airplanes doing their thing. We had maybe even bumped shoulders in the BX commissary or one of the other facilities on base, not knowing that he was going to give his life 10 years later for the freedoms that I enjoy today. The Vietnamese came back to the peace table, And we had a public reading of the Accord on the 26th of January, 1973. And essentially on the 12th of February, 1973, 591 Americans, including civilians, were homeward bound. A friend of mine was asked, could you define freedom? And he simply said, doors with inside knobs. You think of the opportunities that we all have every day simply because we can walk up to a door and open it and venture into the other side. Sadly, I received the welcome home that belonged to many Vietnam veterans who never had that opportunity. They timed it as such that our heroes were brought home in the middle of the night. There was somebody there from the State Department ordering them to remove their uniform as not to offend anyone. They were not given the common courtesy of allowed to wear their uniforms home. They had to pack them in their duffel bag as not to offend anyone. The welcome that I got belonged to them. And I'll never forget the sacrifices they have made for this country and still make. To me, as I look back on my nearly 79 years here on earth, I'll always say the saddest moment to me is when we forgave those who ran before we as a nation stood up and said thank you to those who served. It's kind of interesting, in the 2000 census, like I said, we have over 7 million veterans, 3.2 million served in country. Over 1 million were dead by the turn of the century. But on the official census of 2000, we had 12,200,000 claimed Vietnam veterans. In terms of losses, 300,000 permanent injury, over 58,000 dead, over 1,500 still missing in action, joined to some 83,000 from other wars that wait for us to give them a proper homecoming. 20,000 kids grew up without a father. Me personally, only 1 out of 5 air crew members shot down over Southeast Asia survived. So I can truly say I'm one of the luckiest men alive. Vietnam was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the press at home. Walter Cronkite described the Tet Offensive in 1968 as a defeat for America. We killed, wounded, and captured nearly 4,500 North Vietnamese soldiers. We lost 100 brave men. Cronkite described that as a defeat. LBJ said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost a war. As a result of that, our country was unable to separate the war from the warrior in the Vietnam era. In their mind, if the war was bad, the warrior was bad. It wasn't until '91, when our brave young men and women were coming back from the first Gulf War, and the Kennedys, the Fondas, and the Carries took to the airways to criticize their service to the country. And it was a Vietnam veteran who stood up and said, hell no, not again. As a result of that, this nation has learned the difference between war and warrior. And we have, as a nation, been able to honor our warriors no matter what your feelings are about the war that we're tasked to take part in. In closing, I would like to share with you the words of a friend of mine who has long since passed. As we say in in the flying game, he flew west. He said, during my years of captivity, one idea has dominated my thinking. How fortunate I am to be an American. I've had every real and imaginative fault of the United States of America pointed out to me time and time again by my captors. But I've returned with a strong conviction, although we are far from perfect, our system excels all others on earth, and that our basic ideas and principles are honorable and just. This last paragraph that Dave wrote, he was looking at the young men and women who wear the uniforms of our country today when he expressed faith in what they were going to do for us. And when he said, I have faith that we will continue to work for a peaceful world and freedom while firmly resisting those who would enslave mankind. Quite a responsibility that we place on the men and women in our uniform today. You know, it was Ronald Reagan who said some people spend an entire lifetime wondering if they made a difference, but our armed forces doesn't have that problem. Quite often I get asked, what can I do to honor a veteran? Everybody thinks the monetary value or whatever, but really, if you want to honor a veteran, vote. That's all he put his life on the line, for you to have the opportunity to have the government of your choosing. You say, well, I don't know a veteran. Visit any cemetery, find a bronze plaque, or visit a national cemetery. Go in there and write that name down. Put it in your pocket. Take it with you to the polls. And after you get done expressing your desires for the government of your choosing, you just take that name out, repeat it, and say thank you. And that's all we in the wear the uniform want you to do, is to have the government of your choosing. A friend of mine who was a World War II POW, he gave me a bumper sticker that I keep in my library room, and it just simply says, only two defining forces ever offered to die for you. Jesus Christ and the American soldier. One died for your soul, the other died for your freedom. In this great land of ours, from sea to shining sea, it's full of dreams. You might say simply that some people dream the dream. Some people live the dream. Our armed forces defend that dream. God bless the defenders of the dream. Thank you. I guess some things we can also get into show and tell for those who have interest in history. I have a 100-year-old brick that came out of the Hanoi Hilton in 1973, and I personally brought it back, so I know it came from Hanoi Hilton because we stood out there and bought it from a Vietnamese that went inside and picked it up. So I tell them that if they ever decide to build a Hilton back, they'll be one brick shy.
Can you entertain some questions?
Yes, sir.
You ever have any contact with any of the guys you were in there with?
Yes, sir. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago with 90 of us. The lives are still as good as ever. The oldest one there was 93, and I was probably the next to the youngest. But yeah, we meet every year. This was our 49th anniversary, and we're going back for in the next year on the 23rd of May, 2023 for our 50th anniversary at Richard Nixon's Library. This will be, we did the 20, 30, 40, and now we're gonna do the 50.
Did the two people that went down with you survive as well?
All four of us got off the airplane, and we got separated, and three of us made it to the Hilton. The other one was, he got separated from us, like I said, and they didn't know he was there. And while they were putting all the attention to us, he escaped into Laos. And during the escape attempt in Laos, he was killed in 1967. I don't know if any of you seen the movie Rescue Dawn. That's my co-pilot. Dingler was a Navy pilot, and he was a survival specialist, and they escaped together, and Martin and them, they experienced about 2 weeks of freedom before they succumbed to no water, no food, and trying to get food and water. Dwayne Martin was executed by the Laotians, but Dingler managed to get away at that point, and he was picked up about 3 days later and came back to Youngstown.
What kind of aircraft were you in that was shot down?
HH-43B. We jokingly say pre-green. You know, everybody talks about the Jolly Green Giant. You know, right? We looked like an egg beater turned upside down. It was actually designed by a lady. I guess she dropped an egg beater one day, and that's how she said, "That may make a good airplane." You know? Yes.
And it had Walter Cronkite properly reported the outcome of head events in 1968, you might have been home in summer of 68.
It would have changed everything.
He falsely, he failed the American public to report what damage was done.
Unfortunately, the press has failed this country in many, many ways, and so he's not the only one. There were ones before him, there'll be ones after him, and there's still ones that they think that what they, you know, like I said, that it's not based on the news anymore. I don't know where you would get in the news because everything has a slant to it. But they
were in fact defeated.
Hmm?
They were in fact
Oh yeah,
defeated.
yeah. They've owned up to the fact that they probably would not have survived 5 or 6 more days with what was going on. And the best thing that happened to us or them was for us to stop the bombing, try to get that old Humpty Dumpty elected.
You said there were 59,000 who were killed. You said 37,000 under the age of 19. Did I get that right?
There's 39 that were under the age of 39,000 that were under the age of 22, and there's 36,000 that were 19 and under. And that's the things that they don't report. You know, we old men don't fight wars. You know, they stand back and direct them, I guess you might say. But yeah, we send our youth, and as the war gets more sophisticated, or more wars we get involved in, that age is grown. What has happened in my era and before, the military active duty did most of the fighting, but then they got this magic thing of saving money, and we started turning over the responsibility to the Guard and Reserve. And like out here at McGee Tyson, you've got guys that have anywhere from 10 to 15 deployments in their weekend duty, you know, and so we have abused our Guard and Reserve. That's not what they were designed for. In fact, my ex-son-in-law used to go to a Guard unit to fill in while they went and did his job. I mean, this is one of the things they did.
One thing that surprises me is when we were in the service, I was in the Air Force at the same time as you. The thing that surprises me with the reserve units is that when we were in the service and stuff, they would activate a active group in the States, not reserves. And the reserves, yes, I'm sorry. But the reserves would go to a base still in the United States and then activate the full-time military to go to, say.
Yeah, they did it. They joined, like down at Warner Robins, down there, Robins Air Force Base. They had Guard, Reserve, and active duty all merged together. And you're talking about confusing mess. You know, you would have a E6 Air Force guy that was in charge of an E9 guard guy. That one was like a lead balloon. You know, because the active duty was supposed to be in charge, but you know, you know, it's had some growing pains, but like I said, especially the Air Guard units, you know, that you know, they got airplanes, and you know, like I said, when you think about the number of tankers we got left, and we got 6 at McGee Tyson, but most of the time half of them are gone, you know. That's how much they're being utilized. You know.
How much communication were you able to have with your family back here?
Well, I was listed as missing in action for 2.5 years before the Vietnamese even owned up that I was alive.
So they didn't know for that long?
I had written a letter, but it didn't come through official sources, so the Air Force would not recognize the letter, you know, because I guess a delegation was visiting North Vietnam, and I wrote a letter at Christmas of '65, and they got it in March or April of '66. And what had happened in the East Germans, and when they got to Hong Kong, they just dropped it in the mailbox, and they showed up to my house. And my dad called the Air Force and says, I got a letter from my son. They said, that's impossible. And he said, well, okay, you know. They said, well, just send it to us. And my dad says, you know where I live. If you want to see this letter, you need to come to the house. If you want a copy of it, you better bring a copying machine, because you ain't taking it anywhere. And but they still wouldn't change because the Vietnamese wouldn't change it. And there were guys that their families found out the night before we were released that they were alive. We had 4 or 5 female wives who had remarried because they had had memorial services for their loved ones. And in fact, I got a dear friend who wrote a book called Two Souls Invincible. A week before she was getting remarried, they found out her husband was alive. And in fact, just as a reminder, he keeps that stone in his backyard. They had put one in Greensboro in the local cemetery in his honor, and they went and dug it up and brought it to the house.
What's your thoughts or opinion, I guess, on the code of conduct for prisoner of war that was carried over from World War II and Korea War? And I guess it was in place when you were
Yes.
captive, and it's been since changed, I think.
It hasn't changed much. It's still name, rank, and serial number, date of birth. But we realized that we were put in difficult circumstances. And our leaders expanded it a little bit and said not to sustain permanent injury and know when to say when. In other words, what we knew was too valuable to give up, so you would take it to a point. In other words, when you say force, once they resort to force to get something from you, you have defeated them. And so it doesn't matter how far they take it at that point. But once they laid a hand on you, in other words, if you willfully gave them something, that's a whole different ballgame. But if they brutalized you, you knew you had to figure out when to say when. And I said that with all the fancy rules, there's only one rule we live by. And you think about it. We've all, in our young age, have always said that, can I live with this the rest of my life? And that's kind of what my mother told me years and years ago when I was a kid. You know, you don't do something you regret. And that was, you might say, our governing situation is that, can I live with this the rest of my life? Is it worth dying for or whatever? But once you resorted to force, or they resorted to force to accomplish their mission, you had defeated them. It was just up to you. And and our leaders, like I said, sometimes they took it a little bit too far, but they were strong people, but they definitely strived to set an example for all of us.
To my knowledge, there were no prisoners of war that were tried for any kind of treason or any violation of code? Are you aware of anybody that's prosecuted by the military for?
I know the charges were brought against some, but they were dropped. They handled it administratively. I know that we had one guy, he was the second youngest major in the United States Marine Corps, the youngest lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. And his punishment was he became a veteran service officer for Jerry Brown, the state of Jerry Brown. So that tells you, but his promotion to full colonel was taken away from him.
For his conduct as a prisoner of war.
His conduct was a prisoner of war. In fact, John Peter Flynn, I went through officer training school while I was in prisoner of war camp, and that was one of the things there was only 3 enlisted guys up north, and of course we brought some up from the south later on. And when those guys, charges were filed against them, they went to General Flynn and tried to make a big issue of the officers mistreating the enlisted guys, and the fact that General Flynn, he didn't take the first no. When we got back, they said that was a nice thing to do, go through OTS and, but forget it, just go have a beer and wash it down, and they said, but we'll talk to General Flynn. And when General Flynn came back in March of '73, he went through every stage of the conduct, as far as talking to his boss, to his boss, to his boss. He did not get a single no, a yes, all the way from here to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense says, if these guys won't do it, I'm not going to do it. And General Flynn requested a meeting with the president. And so, truthfully, I guess I jokingly say that President Nixon at that time needed a positive story, and when he went in and briefed President Nixon of what he had done for us, and he felt it should be it, President Nixon turned to Secretary of Defense and make it happen. And so we were commissioned 3 days after President Nixon put his stamp of approval on it. So I can truly say I got a presidential appointment. Somebody was going to introduce me and said, you got a congressional? I said, no, I got a presidential appointment.
Did the government ever do anything to show their appreciation for what you guys went through?
Well, yeah, they paid the guys in South Vietnam $37 a day to live in Saigon, and they paid us $1 a day to live in Hanoi. But they tried to give us double time for a POW time, and unfortunately, thanks to Kennedy, he attached a rider to it granting amnesty, and it fell like a rock. And then they picked up and gave amnesty, but they never went back and revisited the issue. The idea was that we had so many guys that were captains and majors that, were 15 to 18 years in service, and where are we going to put these guys? And, it wasn't a large group of us. And so they said, well, we'll just give them double time for the POW time, and they can retire. But that fell through, thanks to Ted Kennedy. Of course, you might know that I mentioned him a couple of times, but he's not on my list of favorite people. but it's a lot of politics, you might say, and everything. They did find a loophole and gave us a little bit of Social Security money, but as far as coming out, World War II in Korea, they got minimum wage for their POW time. Of course, over the years, World War II, you had to be held 90 days to be a prisoner of war. And so a lot of guys didn't get that quote credit because they weren't held that long. And then in Korea, they moved it down to 30 days. And then in Vietnam, because of the situation, they moved it down to basically overnight. You could classify, and we have you know, every once in a while, we have people that pop up that, you know, were captured and due to circumstances, they were held for just a few days and then they were executed or escaped. And we actually, was 591 of us that came out, but we went back and when the government came to all its schools, and we ended up with 802 total prisoners of war from the Vietnam era. By going back and going by the set rules, the guys that were captured and escaped that could prove it, you know. Of course, you know, like I said, anytime somebody tells you, when I was on such a top secret mission, that only me and the commander knew about it, you might as well roll your pants leg up.
What was that plane trip like back to the States when you got out of there?
I'm sorry?
What was that plane trip like?
It was basically a heaven on earth. You know, we had been there long enough, we were ready to move forward. And so we didn't require much coaching to get on the airplane or much coaching to do anything. If you just had a seat, we'd take it.
How was the adjustment when you got home?
For us, again, when I say old guys, we had been there for a while, you know, we had adjusted and we were ready to move on. Now, some of those guys that were shot down towards the end of the war, they were only in there from 6 to, you know, basically, my friend Bill O'Cure was shot down on the 18th of December and released on 12th of February because of his injuries. So, you know, some of those guys have had a lot of adjustment problems. One is because they got the same recognition we did, and they didn't feel they were deserving of it. And we tried to tell them over and over again, once you walk in through the gates of hell, you're not going to be there long to get a dose of it, you know, and that's kind of what we felt as a prisoner of war situation. But some of them had quite an adjustment. I didn't even know a lot of that until the Iran crisis, when those guys spent 444 days. They come back and they had all kinds of issues trying to readjust. And that's when I learned that our younger, when I say younger, most of them were either on the second or third tour, but it was just their first experience as prisoners of war. But they had a lot of adjustment problems. The shock that their family went through, you know. In fact, I was with a friend down in his wife, 2 months before, about 2 months, I think, 2 months before he was shot down, her brother was shot down and killed in Vietnam. And then she was dealing with that, and in less than 2 months, her husband was shot down. And so she had a whole handful. And her brother was on a secret mission, and the government has not released any information in regards to where he was or what he was doing or anything. The family is still living in that unknown category. But she had that to deal with, and then her husband being shot down, and he spent 2 years up there with her. So.
Did you weigh enough that your family even recognized you?
Well, my sister said they may have took his weight, but they didn't take his southern accent.
You sounded the same.
Yeah, I didn't get my southern drawl from a Dixie cup.
Well, we thank you for your program, and I think everybody probably would agree that's one of the most moving programs we've
Thank you.
had.
It certainly was an honor to be here.
I wish we had 1,000 people here.
I do too, I do
hear
too.
this.
Yes.
I have some copy of my books if anybody is interested in it.
Yes.
It's called The Longest Rescue. I have the paperback and the hardback if anyone's interested. And like I said, this is he even still got some Vietnamese mortar that's on that block. But that's it.
Thank you much.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate
Thank
it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Bo, you want to say a word about